well, what is a great path now? Because I often see, I often hear that he should just, claim victory and go home. But without the Strait of Hormuz, it looks as if the entire Middle Eastern region would shift very, very quickly to the advantage of Iran, as you and I have spoken about before as well. It's when Iran has control of the Strait of Hormuz, they can get the reparations. They already indicated that they're going to put a higher toll on countries who have joined in on the attack of Iran or sanctioning Iran. So they can get rid of the sanctions. They can get countries to play ball. They can probably extend it, put higher toll on countries which threatens Iran by hosting U.S. bases. So you can see a lot of the system, regional structures or even the global system unravel just because of this one strait. So it seems very important. So on one hand, the U.S. can't afford to leave it in Iran's hands, or it could, but then it would have to accept huge changes in the world, but it also can't defeat Iran. So what is the solution? Because it is quite a mess Trump has gotten himself into. So, I guess he could use some good advice.
Well, at the risk of being a bit repetitive, let me tell you what I think the three options are, two of which I think you clearly defined. One is we can maintain the status quo, which is just to keep the blockade on. The American blockade of the Strait stays on, and the Iranian blockade of the Strait stays on. And the operating assumption there is that we will be able to do so much damage to Iran that they will throw up their hands and surrender, and we will get a victory. The second option is you believe that's not going to work. That's due in large part to the fact that blockades take a long time to have an effect, and we don't have time on our side, we meaning the United States. So what we have to do, and you see, lots of people on the right and lots of people who supported the attack on Iran making this argument today. You see it in the Wall Street Journal editorials, for example, that the blockade alone is probably not going to work. So what we have to do is go back to bombing as well. And the argument there is that bombing plus the blockade, those two instruments in tandem will do the job, right? That's the second option. And the third option is to cut a deal with Iran. But the problem is if you cut a deal with Iran, Iran wins. And this would be a bitter pill for President Trump to swallow. And furthermore, Israel and its supporters in the United States who have huge influence do not want that under any circumstances. So this is the difficult position that President Trump is in. He's got these three options. And just to go back over how viable each one is. With regard to maintaining the status quo and just keeping the blockade on, the problem is it's not going to work. And that's the reason that the Wall Street Journal is saying that you need the blockade plus bombing. The blockade alone won't work because it can definitely inflict massive punishment on Iran. There's no question about that. The blockade, the U.S. blockade, and what the United States did to Iran in terms of sanctions before February 28th has inflicted great damage on Iran. No doubt about it. But the Iranians are not going to surrender, right? No matter how much punishment we inflict on them, because we represent an existential threat. The United States and Israel are an existential threat to Iran, and they'll fight to the last person before they surrender. They would be nuts to surrender. So that option's off the table. Then you can bomb plus keep the blockade on. But once you go to bombing, the Iranians will retaliate, and this will just increase the speed at which we head towards the precipice. It'll do great economic damage. Furthermore, we don't have the weaponry to continue the war. We've used up a huge amount of our precious weaponry in the early stages of the war, and the last thing we want to do is use up the rest of it in the next stage of this war, especially since it won't matter because the Iranians will retaliate and they will not surrender. They didn't surrender at first, and they're not going to surrender now. So going to war makes no sense. I would also add to this, Glenn, and we could talk about this. I think from Iran's point of view, it would be a good thing if the war started up again. If I were an Iranian leader, I'd hope that the Americans start the war up again. They start bombing again, because that plays to my advantage. It gives Iran more leverage. But anyway, maintaining the status quo and the blockade plus bombing option, those two options just don't deliver the bacon. So you're left with cutting a deal. And in my opinion, that's the only thing Trump can do. And when the economic pressure becomes great enough, that's what he will do. But in the meantime, he can't do that because Israel and its lobby here in the United States won't let him do it. You want to remember that we went into this war with 4 big goals, and we have failed to achieve any of them. 0, right? No regime change. Iran's ballistic missile force remains intact and is formidable. They're still supporting the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And in terms of their nuclear enrichment capability, we may cut a deal that's better than the JCPOA. But the key point is they're not getting rid of their nuclear enrichment capability, which was one of the big 4 goals. So we failed. And then when you look at what else has happened, Iran, which did not control the Strait of Hormuz on February 27th, now controls it and has a toll booth in it and has no intention of giving up the strait. Furthermore, on February 27th, we had a very impressive alliance structure with the 6 GCC countries in the Gulf. That alliance structure has been shattered. Furthermore, on February 27th, we had all these bases in the Persian Gulf that looked very impressive. They've either been destroyed or badly damaged. On February 27th, we had done a very good job of pivoting to Asia. Not perfect, but starting on February 28th, we started pivoting away from Asia. Our ability to contain China has diminished significantly since February 28th because we've been moving military assets out of East Asia. And furthermore, we have been burning up precious weaponry in the war against Iran. I could go on and on. What I'm telling you very simply is we have not achieved any of our goals, and we've created a lot of problems since February 28th that didn't exist on February 27th. We've lost. How can anybody plausibly spin out a story that we've won this war, that we've achieved what we set out to do? And the economic situation continues to deteriorate, and the pressure on President Trump to settle is very great before we go off the precipice. So he, I am sure, behind closed doors, is trying to figure out how he can get some sort of deal that he can possibly sell as a victory. How he can do that, I don't know. But I think that's what they're trying to do. But meanwhile, you can rest assured that the Israelis and their supporters, there are many powerful supporters in the United States, are telling him in no uncertain terms that he can't cut a deal with Iran that reflects the fact that Iran won and we lost. And this is why there is no end in sight at the moment. And I don't believe the end will come, or something approximating the end will come, until the economy is really seriously threatened.
We assume rationality and restraint, but if the West faces and the US here faces a massive defeat, one often does. Rationality often goes out the window. Just by comparison with Europeans, it's worth remembering that back in 2022, they were a bit reluctant to go in and fight the Russians before Biden convinced them. But there's so much at stake now for the Europeans, they see, if they could defeat the Russians, then they would have a powerful Ukrainian shield in front of them, which they could use to weaken Russia. Behind them, they would have the big, powerful United States. So it would be a good position to be in. And essentially, unipolarity would have another go, perhaps. If they're being very optimistic. However, if they lose against the Russians, the Ukraine will be diminished, partly absorbed by Russia, and the United States would then likely pack up and go, as we see now with the US pulling some troops out of Germany. So there's a lot at stake, and for this reason, you see now a massive rationality on the European side. I get the impression the leaders are prepared to go to war with Russia if necessary. I mean, there's the journalists, the politicians. It's kind of frightening to see the way they talk. It's rationality doesn't seem to be a good defining characteristic at the moment. But to compare it to Iran, though, if the US has so much to lose from losing this war and a lot to gain if it's able to defeat Iran in terms of weakening China, Russia, restoring or regaining Israeli dominance in the region, do you think it's unthinkable that the US might go very far up that escalation ladder, considering even nuclear weapons, something to essentially break the backs of the Iranians? I often make this point when I talk to the Iranians that you don't want to defeat the US too much because it's you don't want to make a very powerful country too desperate.
Yeah, great question. Now, I think it's very important when you talk about the United States and Iran that you realize that you're not just talking about the United States, you're talking about the United States and Israel. These two countries are what I like to call a tag team. They're joined at the hip. And the truth is that they look at Iran in different ways. Iran is not a serious threat to the United States. It just isn't. You can't make that argument on rational legal grounds. But from Israel's point of view, Iran is an existential threat. And one could argue, this is a bit simplistic, but nevertheless, there's a large element of truth in it. If it's an existential threat to Israel, it's an existential threat to the United States. And therefore, the United States is forced, because of Israel, to treat Iran as an existential threat. But even if that's not completely true, the fact is that Israel treats Iran as an existential threat. And the most worrying scenario from an Israeli point of view, and even from an American point of view, because again, they're joined at the hip, is if Iran has a nuclear weapon. And if Iran maintains its nuclear enrichment capability, which it is almost certain to do, from Israel's point of view, this is the same as Iran being able to get a nuclear weapon. They'll be on the road to acquiring a nuclear weapon as long as they have a nuclear enrichment capability. So I think there is a real chance that if a deal is cut and Iran basically wins and keeps its nuclear enrichment capability, that the Israelis will be tempted to use nuclear weapons against Iran. I think that's a real problem. And I think there'll be real limits to what the United States can do to prevent that. Now, your question was, would the United States use nuclear weapons? I find that hard to believe, but that may be wishful thinking on my part. And we want to remember that President Trump has talked about wiping Iran or Iranian civilization off the face of the earth and making it so that Iran could never come back from the dead. He's threatened this kind of genocidal policy, which is consistent with using nuclear weapons against Iran. So it is possible that the United States would countenance using nuclear weapons against Iran. I think all of this gets back to the basic logic that you're spinning out, which is that when countries get desperate, when they see themselves being in a desperate strategic situation, you don't want to underestimate the risks that they might be willing to take. Now, you would argue, I think, that Israel using nuclear weapons is irrational, but I'm not condoning that idea for 1 second, but you could make an argument that from Israel's point of view, that's the rational thing to do. They view Iran with nuclear weapons as the coming of a second Holocaust, and therefore it makes eminently good sense to pursue that policy. Yes, it's risky. It's extremely risky. Do we want to do it? No. But do we have any choice? No. It would be that kind of argument. So I think you don't want to underestimate the extent to which Israel will think seriously about using nuclear weapons in the future against Iran. And maybe even the United States would do the same. And if I could make one more point, just going back to the Ukraine case, because you see a similar logic at play there. You and I both know Sergei Karaganov, and you know him quite well. Sergei, for those in the audience who don't know, is a Russian strategic thinker of about my vintage, which means he goes back into the Cold War days. And he has been arguing that the Europeans have lost sight of the fact that we live in a nuclear world. And the Europeans think that they can do things to Russia and act in ways, hostile ways towards Russia, as if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, and nuclear deterrence and nuclear weaponry don't matter. And Karaganov's point is the only way you're going to put an end to this kind of thinking, which he finds remarkably foolish, and I agree with him on that, is for the Russians to use a few nuclear weapons against Ukraine or against the West in a demonstrative way. In other words, Karaganov is not talking about starting a general thermonuclear war, but he's talking about employing a handful of nuclear weapons to remind the Europeans that we live in a world where there are nuclear weapons, and there's a chance that we'll get us incinerated if they're used. And what Karaganov wants to do is throw the Europeans and the Russians out on the slippery slope to oblivion, and basically remind the Europeans that the last clear chance to avoid nuclear catastrophe is for them to wake up and understand that they cannot threaten the Russians in an existential way. Now, you might say that Karaganov is crazy or that this is irrational, but I think you can spin a plausible story that although we hope very much that this doesn't happen, that from the Russian point of view, it is a rational strategy. It's filled with risks for sure. But the argument that someone like Karaganov would make that the risks of allowing the Europeans, with help from the United States, to wreck Russia is just unacceptable. And something has to be done to stop that. And if that involves using a handful of nuclear weapons, so be it. That is the smart strategy. Regrettable, but smart. I'm just laying out the logic of using nuclear weapons in Ukraine and in the Middle East that show you why the situation in both places is so dangerous.
Yeah. No, I get the difference. I often make the point to people because there's often a lot of confusion when one says, because you and I also spoke in the past about Iran has it's rational for it to acquire nuclear weapons. It's not a normative argument what we wish would happen. It's the incentives of states as they compete for security. And just for context on Karaganov, he's been quite influential both in the Soviet Union and in Russia. He wrote speeches for Brezhnev. He advised everyone from Gorbachev to Yeltsin and Putin. Indeed, he had a very key role in pushing for the change in Russia's nuclear doctrine and convincing Putin to do so. I was in the room twice when Karaganov, on the Valdai setting, when Karaganov was advocating for changing the nuclear posture of Russia. And when Putin was essentially pushing back. But eventually, Russia changed its nuclear posture by essentially lowering the threshold because of Karagno. So one can't say that he's not influential. And but the rationality, the way I see it, is that Russia needs its deterrence, because that's one thing that gradually got chipped away over the past 4 years. And I often make the point in Europe, or in the West, that this idea of celebrating how Russia's not standing up for its red lines, we have to be careful what we wish for, because now one has set in place anger in Russia among many in the establishment that we let our deterrence slip, and now it has to be restored. Even this, when you see drones attacking Russia coming out of the Baltic states, I mean, is this the new normal? The Europeans can just launch attacks at Russia, and Russia doesn't dare to do anything. They really say now that this has to come to an end. And I'm actually having him, Kraganov, on this program on Thursday, so I will ask him what he
Yes.
if we should wait for Judgment Day now, because we are going down a very different path, but the dangerous path. But that kind of goes into my same argument with the Americans. You don't want to defeat the Americans, humiliate the Americans too much in the Middle East either, because one could end up, pushing them into a corner, same as the Israelis for that sake. So, you don't want to defeat your enemies too much. Is my point, which I also made to the Iranians. But where do you see all of this going then? Given that we now appear to be returning into warfare between the US and Iran, is it
before I go and answer your question on Iran and where I see that one headed, I just want to go back to the Ukraine-Russia situation for a second. The two events that really profoundly shocked me were, number one, when the Ukrainian army, with support from the United States and Britain, invaded Mother Russia. This was the Kursk offensive. I believe it was in 2024. Just think about that. Ukraine, with help from the United States and Britain, invaded Russia. This would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. Unthinkable. During the Cold War, I once had a lengthy discussion with some policymakers about the question of what the United States and NATO would do if you had a war in Central Europe and the Warsaw Pact defenses cracked, and we had the option of moving deep into Eastern Europe and maybe eventually moving into the Soviet Union itself. It was a hypothetical situation. But everybody understood that you would not want to move deep into Eastern Europe, much less invade the Soviet Union, threaten the survival of the Soviet Union, a country that had many thousands of nuclear weapons. Well, here you are in 2024. Ukraine invades Russia with ground forces. It conquers territory. Truly amazing. Then the second thing that happens is that the Ukrainians, again with assistance from the Americans and the British, launch attacks on one leg of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. You remember that the Ukrainians targeted Russian strategic bombers. This is their strategic nuclear forces. It was unthinkable that you would do that in the Cold War, even if you had the opportunity, because you understood full well that this might invite retaliation by the Soviet Union, and you might end up in a general thermonuclear war. But we didn't seem to mind at all that the Ukrainians hit one leg of the Russian strategic nuclear triad. Truly amazing to me. So all of this, I think, supports Karaganov's basic point that the West, and this includes just not the Europeans, but the Americans as well, seem to have lost sight of the fact that nuclear weapons are present in the system, and they should affect how great powers interact with each other. And we appear to have forgotten that lesson. And again, Karaganov's point is that the West needs to be reminded. But I just wanted to talk about those two incidents. And by the way, you could add a third incident. This is when it looks like the Ukrainians were trying to decapitate the Russian regime by firing missiles at Putin's home. And that, again, is something that would have never happened in the Cold War. Anyway, to go to the Middle East, where are we going from here? I find it hard to believe, because of Israel and because of the lobby, that we're ever going to get a meaningful peace agreement. I find it hard to imagine that the United States and Iran could work out a deal that puts an end to this conflict once and for all. I think if there was no such thing as Israel didn't exist, and the lobby didn't exist, the United States and Iran would have little difficulty working out a modus vivendi. But the fact is, Israel does exist. It's not going away. And the lobby is enormously powerful in policymaking circles in the United States. And because the United States and Israel are therefore joined at the hip, it's going to be almost impossible for President Trump to negotiate some sort of meaningful peace agreement that lasts for a long period of time. So I think, Glenn, you and I will be talking about the Middle East and U.S.-Iran and Israeli-Iran relations for a long time to come.
Well, it's just that, going back to what we discussed earlier on how much the world has shifted historically, such huge shifts in international distribution of power has not happened in peaceful ways. Because keep in mind, only a few years ago, we were told that there was only one center of power in the world, that is the United States, but organized under the political West. We had the whole political class in Europe raised under this idea that there was one center of power, so there would be no more great power rivalry. This one center of power was liberal democracy, so now we're going to have democracy and human rights set as a key pillar of international rules and order. And suddenly, within the span of a few years, we now see China becoming the most competitive economy. We see this, as you said, war with Russia, and when we say Ukraine did it, none of the things they're doing, I think they could do without the West. So, with the assistance, we're also attacking Russia now. And in Iran, we see Iran essentially leaving the U.S. no military option of victory. It's quite a remarkable shift in a very short period of time, and it's not easy for political leaders or even the public to get used to this new division of labor or the distribution of power in such a short period of time. And one can always be pragmatic and say, well, perhaps the U.S. and Iran could set up a regional partnership to adjust to multipolar world. Same with Russia, but it doesn't seem like this is built into human nature, though. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts before we wrap up.
I want to make one final point, Glenn, and that is that when I talk about the changes that have taken place in the world, I tend to treat East Asia, Europe, and the Gulf as the three areas that we should focus on, and I treat them pretty much by themselves. And I talk about China in East Asia, Russia in Europe, and of course, Iran now in the Gulf. But if you think about it, those three areas are tied together in very important ways. The Russians are providing all sorts of assistance to Iran, and the Chinese get a huge slug of oil from Iran through the Persian Gulf. And therefore, China and Russia are involved in what's going on in Iran in a quite serious way, that is likely to increase with the passage of time. And when you think about the war in Ukraine, it is seriously affected by what is happening in the Persian Gulf, in the war against Iran. Just to give you two obvious examples, one is that the United States had to take sanctions off of Russia to increase the amount of Russian oil that's flowing into global markets, which improved Russia's economic position and Russia's position in the war against Ukraine. And furthermore, it's now quite clear that the United States is going to send much less weaponry to Ukraine than it has been up to now, because we've used up so much precious weaponry in the war in Iran. And furthermore, the Russians and the Chinese both have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Iran does not lose the war against the United States. And by the way, countries in the Middle East, like Turkey, which is a NATO member, Turkey has a vested interest in making sure Iran doesn't lose the war against the United States and Israel, because the Turks understand the Israelis have their gun sights on Turkey. Right. So when you begin to look at these different regions, what you see very quickly is that there are significant connections among them. And that tells you it is possible. I mean, you could tell stories where a war that spreads in a place like the Persian Gulf ends up including both the Chinese and the Russians, or just one of them. And you could end up in a great power war that spills out of the Persian Gulf. And as I said before, I think this becomes more likely with the passage of time, not less likely. So we live in dangerous times for sure.
Yeah, the world was clearer, I guess, in the Cold War, because you had two centers of power, two incompatible ideologies. I mean, it's much more difficult to control the different variables at play in this multipolar world, as you pointed out with Turkey, for example, how they, do not have, even though they have the problems with Iran, even Saudi Arabia can make this point. To what extent is it in Saudi Arabia's interest to actually defeat your opponent? And I don't, I think they also would be worried about Israel's territorial ambitions after a defeat of Iran. So I think the whole shift in mentality as well, that peace derives from defeating adversaries. I think we have to return to the basic idea that we should manage the security competition. I think for the Iranians to defeat America, for the Europeans to try to defeat Russia, I think all of this is just a recipe for disaster. Now that's the path we're going down, it seems.
Yeah. And people also ought to remember Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is an extension of politics by other means. And really, the key variable you want to focus on here is politics. I think in the West, this is especially true in the United States, we like to talk about military power. And of course, the Israelis do as well. And the idea is that any political problem we see out there can be solved by military means. Just bring out the big stick and engage in big stick diplomacy, and we'll solve the problem. And I think what we're seeing both in the Ukraine war and in the Iran war, and the Israelis are seeing in places like Lebanon and Gaza, that there are just limits to what you can do with military force alone, and that politics matters enormously. And you can win a war or be very successful militarily in a conflict, but lose it politically. I always like to talk about the Vietnam War, which is a central event in my youth, right? Between 1965 and 1975, the United States won every battle that it fought. We were never defeated on the battlefield by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. We won all the battles, but we lost the war. War is an extension of politics by other means. And there are just real limits to what you can do with military force. And we're finding that out, both in the case of Ukraine and Iran. And hopefully the lesson we learn will stick in our head for a while.
Well, on that somewhat optimistic note, we can leave it there.